So good afternoon, everyone.
Oh, I didn't know, Mom.
I'm John Finnegan. I'm Dean of the School of Public Health. It is my great pleasure to welcome you here today to this very special event. In a few minutes, I'm going to introduce our speakers who will discuss the Rosenhan Experiment. And we believe, as I think you will, that this is one of the most interesting and impactful studies of mental illness care in the last century, not without controversy. So the panel that we have for you today is going to explore this study through their unique lenses, and I know that their diverse perspectives are going to lead to some robust conversation with you and our panelists. So first of all, I want to thank you all for being here, and I want you to know that this event came together very, very quickly. And in fact, we just started planning it about 2 weeks ago. And I think it is a testament to the fact that you pay attention to your email and other social media that brought you here today. So you inspire us. We received more than 200 in-person registrations, and many more are joining us via live stream. So keep that in mind. You're being live streamed. I've been told that entire classes and teams have been invited to view this online, and I think that is a testament to the intrigue of this conversation, which will focus on two important topics of our time: mental illness and scientific research methods. The topic is timely. Everyone in this room and in this country and in this world is affected by variations in our mental health. According to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI, as many people know it, mental illness affects 1 in 5 adults and 1 in 6 youth in the United States alone each year. With some populations, such as our LGBTQ community, the outlook is much more difficult, where more than 1 in 3 adults experience mental illness each year. Suicide is cited as the second leading cause of death among people ages 10 to 34. And these data are staggering, and the sheer number of people affected make this a critical public health issue. Here at the School of Public Health, we explore mental health and cognition from many angles, from genes to social and physical environments, the economics of care, and the powerful relationships that shape our health holistically, mental and physical. Why? Because health is a human right, and so many of the factors that shape our health, for better or for much worse, are of our own making as a species. What we do to each other as individuals and as collectives, including institutions, communities, nations, and societies. So making health a human right drives our work and has since our founding in 1944. This year marks our 75th anniversary, and we celebrate that significant milestone while keeping eyes to the future so that we can be prepared to confront the most persistent and emerging threats to public health, including our mental health. Today, we'll hear more about the evolution of mental illness and research, and how Stanford University psychologist David Rosenhan grappled with a foundational question that doctors and professionals have struggled to define for centuries. How is mental illness diagnosed? And to that end, he and 7 other pseudo-patients went undercover and feigned symptoms to be admitted to psychiatric institutions. This study opened a critique of psychiatric diagnosis and dramatically affected the field of psychiatry. However, the story is far more complicated than it first appears. The study has drawn criticism of the validity and reliability of its methods about what truly happened behind those closed asylum doors. I want to welcome our speakers today, starting with our special guest, Susannah Cahalan, Susannah Cahalan. Since her best-selling memoir, Brain on Fire, in which she chronicles her own struggles with modern medicine after being misdiagnosed with a serious mental illness. Susannah has become a leading voice on the treatment of mental illness in America, and her new book, The Great Pretender, and I got her to autograph it. Thank you. Definitely, I've already started reading it. It is absolutely a page turner. It has already received, as you probably know, some high-profile reviews, including a recent review in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. You will have a chance to purchase a signed copy of the book after today's presentation, if you are so inclined. Next, I would like to introduce Harry Lando, and by chance, when Harry was a PhD student, a doctoral student, 24 years old at Stanford University. Were we ever 24 years old? I guess we were at some point. Yes, we were. He participated in the Rosenhan Experiment as the 9th pseudo-patient. And we'll hear much more about his experience in just a few minutes. Yet that experience has nothing to do with what Harry has been doing as the focus of his career over the past 50 years. He is a professor of epidemiology at the School of Public Health, and he is internationally recognized for his work in smoking cessation and tobacco control. And he has been active in this field since 1969, publishing more than 250 scientific publications, holding prominent national and international positions, and receiving numerous awards for his outstanding contributions. By the way, he is currently chair of the advisory committee to the Union on the World Conferences on Tobacco or Health. Finally, I want to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Dr. Donna McAlpine. Donna is an associate professor of health policy and management right here at the School of Public Health, whose research has focused on alcohol, drug, and mental health care, and also racial and ethnic disparities in health outcomes and treatment. Each year, Dr. McAlpine invites Dr. Lando to speak to students in one of her classes about his experience in the Rosenhan Experiment to advance their understanding of research methods. And it is now my great pleasure to turn the mic over to Dr. McAlpine.
Thank you, Dean Finnegan, and thank you all for coming, and thank you all who are joining us by streaming. It really is a pleasure and a privilege to get to moderate this. Susannah, I've been a fan of yours, an admirer of your earlier memoir called Brain on Fire that talks about your own experiences with mental health and illness, and was profoundly meaningful for lots of people suffering with symptoms of what seemed to be psychosis. And her new work, The Great Pretender, for those who haven't read it yet, it's just a great read. I'm a big fan of mystery novels, and when I'm not doing my work, which is often, I'm reading a mystery novel. And it very much reads like that, where it's a whodunit and a page turner, and you're thinking, is she going to find the pseudo-patient? Spoiler alert, she doesn't find the pseudo-patient, except for Harry. Harry, it's a great privilege to be up here with you two. As the dean said, Harry has come to my classes for a number of years to talk about this experiment, and he's not only one of my favorite, he's not only my favorite footnote in a famous paper ever, but he's also one of my favorite people. So thank you so much to Harry for being here. And after our discussion, you'll have a chance to ask questions either by the mic or by a card. So the staff will be passing out cards. So if you have any questions you want to address, feel free to write them. So before we start a discussion, it might be helpful just to remind ourselves what the Rosenhan Experiment was all about. So most of you have probably read it. Many of you probably have read it as undergrads, as one of the classic experiments. And just really briefly, he published it in 1973. It was called Being Sane in Insane Places. And David Rosenhan published it in one of the best peer-reviewed journals that we have, the journal called Science. And he describes a really fascinating experiment where he sent 8 pseudo-patients to try to be admitted to 12 mental hospitals. And they, upon admission, or to try to get admitted, all they said was that they heard voices, and the voices said 3 words: thud, hollow, and empty. And they were going to see if just saying that they had those symptoms would get them admitted, and sure enough, it did. And then after admission, they weren't to have any more symptoms. They had no more symptoms, and in the stories they told the doctors and the staff were just their personal history. So they didn't make anything else up except their names and sometimes their jobs. And Rosenhan said, well, it was amazing because all of these patients were admitted, most of them with the diagnosis of schizophrenia. None of them were detected, and their length of stay in the hospital ranged from about a week to 52 days. And upon discharge, all of the 8 patients were given a diagnosis of schizophrenia in remission. And in the article, Rosenhan talks about that he himself was one of those patients, those pseudo-patients, and he gives a little bit of background on some of the other pseudo-patients. Like one he says was an artist, another a housewife, a few of them were psychologists. And he used his findings to make the argument that we don't really know the difference between, at the time, what he would have called sanity and insanity. Now luckily we have better words, so we'd call it, we don't know the difference between mental illness and mental health. And shortly after I came to the University of Minnesota, my own training is in the sociology of mental health and illness. Shortly after I came to the University of Minnesota, I was at a faculty meeting, and we were gossiping. And the exciting faculty gossip of the time was, did you know Harry Lando was one of Rosenhan's pseudo patients? Faculty gossip. And I thought that was just fascinating. So I started to invite Harry to my class, either my medical social class or my mental health policy class. And I didn't know at the time that Harry was, I invited him because he was a pseudo patient. I didn't realize at the time that he was a footnote. The Rosenhan didn't report his results. Instead, he said that Harry hadn't gone along with the protocol, so his information wasn't included in the original study. And I didn't know at the time that Harry subsequently, later in the 70s, published his own account of the experiment that told quite a different story. So that's sort of my background of how I got exposed to the Rosenhan experiment, and how, since my days as an undergrad to now teaching mental health and illness. So maybe we could start by talking more about how you both got exposed to the Rosenhan experiment. Harry as a student and as a pseudo patient, and Susannah as, I think you spent 6 years studying it. So maybe we'll start with Harry. How did you come to be a pseudo patient?
So I was taking, David Rosenhan was my major professor, and I was taking his psychopathology course, or seminar actually. There were only 8 of us in the seminar. And Rosenhan was talking about the study and going into psychiatric institutions. And, I wasn't the happiest graduate student. And I thought, wow, this might be interesting. It might be quite different. And, another of my colleagues, Bill Underwood, who Susannah probably will talk about, went in. And so it just seemed like something really interesting to do. And I literally had no idea what I was getting into. I'm not a clinical psych student, and I was just kind of amazed at the idea. I mean, the only prep that we really got is we heard voices, empty, thud, and hollow. Now knock on the door at the psychiatric institution, and the rest is up to you. And amazingly, it worked. We got in.
Susannah, how did you come to spend 6 years investigating the experiment?
So my kind of encounter with Rosenhan came from a more kind of circuitous route. So I wrote a book called Brain on Fire, which chronicled my experience with a brief misdiagnosis with schizoaffective disorder and bipolar disorder, and that I was ultimately properly diagnosed with an autoimmune disease of my brain. And after that book came out, I was inundated with a lot of emails, people wanting to connect with me, people looking for answers. Many people found answers after reading my book, got proper diagnoses. It was remarkable. But there was also a kind of a larger subset of people who were in the mental health world with mental health diagnoses, or they had, children or parents or loved ones, and they felt lost, they felt unseen, they felt marginalized, ignored. And those people really started to haunt me. And there was kind of one email exchange in particular that really kind of stuck in my craw, which was with a father whose son had struggled with serious mental illness and was living on the streets and in prison, in and out of prisons and jails. And he had mentioned that my story gave him a lot of hope because he wasn't getting a lot of hope from the psychiatric community. He was basically given the narrative of take these drugs and that's the end of the road. And so when he was reading my book, he thought, well, maybe there's another path that we don't know. But then he saw, a video of me talking about my book. And I was saying these same distinctions that his doctors were saying. I was calling my illness, not psychiatric. It was organic. It was a brain disease. And as opposed to a psychiatric condition, which is not a brain disease, I don't know. So I was making this kind of arbitrary distinction that really was harming his son and nearly could have harmed me. And it was at that moment I realized, oh my gosh, I need to think about these issues in a deeper way. And I was talking about these experiences with two neuroscientists who I was out to dinner with. And one of them turned to me and said, you're kind of a modern day pseudo-patient, testing the nature of diagnosis and finding it flawed, right? And I thought, what is the pseudo-patient? And I remember I read on Being Sane and Insane Places in a kind of lonely hotel room in Boston. And I thought, this is genius. And I recognized myself, not only in the misdiagnosis, but in the labeling and the clinical gaze and how doctors see their patients through the prism of their diagnosis, not as the individual, which is what I experienced firsthand during my brief period of being misdiagnosed. So I came to the study initially as a fan.
Oh yeah, so you thought it would confirm what you had gone through.
Absolutely.
In terms of misdiagnosis.
Absolutely.
And what do you see the contribution of the study to psychiatry? How did it change? How did that study change psychiatry after what you learned through your investigation?
I think there was a pre and post Rosenhan world. I mean, there's so many other things going on at that time. It was psychiatry's anxious worry years, right? It was a time when it was going through an identity crisis. So there were all these studies at the time showing that their diagnostic system was arbitrary at best. That they, if two doctors were seeing the same patient, they had less than chance odds that they'd get the same diagnosis right. And there was another study that was comparing the U.S. diagnosis to the U.K. diagnoses and finding that the same patients were being diagnosed with schizophrenia here and bipolar disorder overseas. And so there was a lot of things going on there. Obviously, the culture was also very kind of doubtful and fearful about psychiatry. This was the era of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Snake Pit. This was the era of expose after expose of the harms of the asylum. So I think that this study kind of stuck right into that, especially at that time. It fed into the culture's idea of what psychiatry's limitations were and its institutions. And I think it also helped push forward this idea that psychiatry really need to fundamentally rethink its role within the kind of wider swath of medicine.
And did it feel like a big deal at the time, Harry? Did it feel like, oh, this is like a big study?
Yes, it did, but not, in reading Susannah's book and getting to know Susannah, I think I really underestimated the impact the study had. I realized at the time, so the article came out, I think in January of '73 in Science, and then like 3 months later, there were no fewer than 12 pages of letters to the editor. And let's say they were not in general fan letters for David Rosenhan. Yeah. And so it clearly got a lot of people very upset. But I was not aware at the time in terms of maybe the longer term impact on psychiatry. The deinstitutionalization movement had started like in the 1950s. But, Susannah kind of describes it as a dagger to the heart of psychiatry. And so even now, it just gives me a perspective that I didn't fully have at that time.
And now we can look back and we can say it was a dagger into the heart of psychiatry. And it did have, even though there was a bunch of other things going on at the same time that were probably leading psychiatry in the same direction, we know it had a big influence on psychiatry. But so knowing that, are you saying in your book that it was a fraud?
No.
Okay.
No, I think that I'm saying it was a missed opportunity.
So, how was the opportunity then?
So in the paper, it's a kind of very black and white. It's very sensationalized. view. And one that I identified with and it kind of stuck right into the heart of my tabloid urges. It was, these institutions are bad. And in fact, Rosenhan in many interviews would say to the effect, basically these institutions are bad and they should be closed. Right, and so that was the kind of narrative that came from that paper, one of the many narratives that came. And as I started to dig deeper, and as I found Harry in particular, not only did I find issues with the study, inaccuracies, inconsistencies, sometimes outright exaggerations, but I also saw that the story is a little bit more complicated than was portrayed in the paper. And it was and what I say about a missed opportunity is that I feel that the paper could have contributed to betterment as opposed to like takedown, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and so going off that, Harry, how did you perceive your experience of being a pseudo patient as different than what Rosenhan presented, and what inspired you to publish your own paper about the study?
My experience was so much different than I had expected or been led to expect. I'd heard all the horror stories and I read One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but I identified with Randall McMurphy, who was kind of the protagonist, and I envisioned myself being Randall McMurphy going into the psychiatric hospital. I literally had no idea what to expect, and I had this fake address in San Francisco. I thought I was going to wind up at Langley Porter, a famous research hospital, but it turned out my fake address was not in their district, and I was supposed to go to San Francisco General. Well, that wasn't right. Let's say that I was feeling a little bit anxious by that time, and I wound up at the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital on the psychiatric ward, and basically it was just entirely different. It was a place where staff were kind, there was caring, there was no depersonalization. I was struck by how much patients cared for each other. The focus was on community type therapy and on relatively short-term stays. So the average length of stay was a month. There was no warehousing. I saw people getting better. And so I have to say that I was quite disappointed, to put it mildly, that Rosenhan chose not to include that perspective.
And so do you think it was a fraud, given he chose not to include your perspective that went against everything else he was saying in the paper?
Fraud is a strong word. I thought it was biased.
What word?
I would say, and then I've learned more from talking to Susannah and reading her book, because there's things she found that I didn't know. I mean, even about myself. So Susannah found Rosenhan's notes and found that there were some pretty serious inaccuracies on basic facts about my hospitalization. He said I was there for 26 days. I was there for 19. He said I was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. I was diagnosed with chronic undifferentiated schizophrenia. He said I was not admitted right away, that I had to wait 3 days. I don't know where he got that from. That wasn't true. So there were some, fundamental factual errors, but I think that part of it is the bias that, yes, he was very interested in diagnosis, but his whole thesis was that psychiatric hospitals are really dehumanizing places. And the irony is, I think that he was largely correct in that assumption. And I was very surprised by the contrary experience I had. I mean, I think he needs to respect the data. And there's a quote that Susannah uses in her book that actually comes from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It was true even if it didn't happen. So there was a lot of truth in that article. And Susannah can talk about this, but now I am questioning whether in fact everything happened as Rosenhan described it, and the pseudo-patients as Rosenhan described them, which did not occur to me at the time.
So yeah, so there's truth in the article, and part of it is confirmed by your own experience, right? The depersonalization, and once you're labeled with having a mental illness. But is the science inaccurate? Was the science made up of the article?
I found an early paper so these were some of the kind of things that I found that troubled me to a degree that really undermined the study for me, even if I do believe that some of the conclusions are valid. I, at one point, found an early draft of On Being Sane and Insane Places that was sent to actually Walter Mischel of the Marshmallow Study to review before he was going to submit the article to Science. And this article almost exactly everything looked almost exactly the same as would ultimately run in science, with one major difference. In that article, there were 9 pseudo-patients, no footnote. In the next article, there were 8 pseudo-patients, 1 footnote.
You became a footnote.
He became a footnote, which leads me to believe he took Harry out of the paper and made him a footnote. However, not one number changed. So you have very specific numbers in this paper. You have 2,100 pills dispensed. You have average number of days. You have numbers of minutes psychiatrists spent out in the ward. How can not one of these numbers change when you have an N of 8? Yeah. So that to me, there's so much gray area in these topics. And that was kind of the kind of most solid ground I could find of, okay, this is not as it seems. And that was very troubling to me. And I remember when we went over it in person, when we met, actually, when I was in Minneapolis here and we met. And I think that really troubled you as someone who does research.
Yes. I say, and I appreciate, the quote in your book, that you really have to respect the data. I mean, you have maybe some preconceptions, but the fact that, in a small N, that my experience was so different, that should have been reflected. And in fact, Susannah was only able to find Bill and I mean, part of that is the study's almost 50 years old, and I think at least a couple of the pseudo-patients at the time were supposed to be in their mid-60s. So not too surprising you didn't find them. But in a small N, to simply not reflect that, I think is a serious issue and a serious problem. And as Susannah said, a missed opportunity.
And do you think there were other pseudo-patients, or do you think it would just, you identify 3, Rosenhan was 1, Harry was another, and another grad student you interview. And you do this exhaustive research for the other pseudo-patients, but never find them.
Yes.
And sometimes find evidence they might not have existed. Do you believe they existed?
Oh, it's hard to pin me down on this one, but I spent 6 years pursuing ghosts, and I interviewed hundreds of people. I traveled the country, the world, trying to find, I hired a private investigator. I was so desperate. I went to the APA and made a speech. I wrote a plea for help in the Lancet. I mean, I went anywhere that would hear me. I was trying to find Rosenhan's pseudo-patients, and all roads led back to Harry and Bill. Very easily, Harry and Bill, Harry and Bill, Harry and Bill. Everything led back. The lawyer who was supposedly hired to write writs of habeas corpus to get them out, which he didn't actually write. Harry and Bill, Harry and Bill. So I want to believe that there are other pseudo-patients out there. Part of this book and this publication and talking about it, I keep thinking someone's going to come up to me. Maybe one of you in the audience is one of the pseudo-patients or a child of a pseudo-patient. And so I'm hoping that I get tapped on the shoulder and someone says to me, I was a pseudo-patient, or I know a pseudo-patient. And so, I want to believe that they existed. And some of the stories of these other pseudo-patients, and I have this because I have David Rosenhan's unpublished book, which is another indication that something was awry, because he wrote the majority of a book that he would never publish. He got a sizable advance for it from a major publisher. Why didn't he deliver this book? And that was something that was an early kind of indication that something was strange here. But in this book, there are details about these pseudo-patients, and one in particular is this famous female abstract artist, whose work hangs in, I think at one point said something like the Met and other major international museums. So I thought, how many women from that era can that describe? So that took me about 6 months of rabbit holing, going through various archives and figuring out no one fit the bill. No one, at one point I thought it was Grace Hartigan. I talked to, I had to go through, people who have her reams of correspondences throughout her lifetime. There was no contact with David Rosenhan. Her close assistant, who had been with her the bulk of her life, didn't know the name David Rosenhan. Exhaustively, I tried to find them. I mean, I really thought that in many ways that if I couldn't find them, the book wouldn't work. And I also really wanted to believe in the study. So I had these 2 animating kind of pushes to find this. And still, again, there was ghosts. I couldn't find them. So I don't know. I want to hope still. I want to hold on to some hope that they're out there.
I can imagine someday you're going to be walking down the street and someone's going to say,
I know. I really look forward to that.
You won't use the word fraud, but you say there's things that make you uncomfortable. And there's clearly in your investigation, there's things that were falsified. And we're currently living in a time where science is under attack. And so this is like one of the classic social science experiments. And so what should we take away from it in terms of how we trust science or evidence, or should we just, echo, it's all fake science, it's all fake science?
No, I really don't. Yeah, I mean, and that's another thing I grappled with. I really wanted this not to be problematic because, I do write a little bit about, the anti-vaxxer movement and things that are kind of feed into this, doubt of expertise in science. And I don't want to feed into that. However, there's a lot of fraud in academia, and there's a lot of maybe like softer fraud, which is massaging of data to fit someone's bias, So when you pull back the layers of it, there's a problem. There's a serious problem in academic research, and you can't deny that. However, I think we have to hold on to belief that people who are, researching these things have good intentions, and that a lot of these studies maybe hopefully are valid. I think it's a lesson for the lay public to really be critical readers, think about where things are published. So that doesn't necessarily always matter because it's science, but, think about who the author is, maybe, their history, look at the data as much as you can. I mean, I don't really know how you fix this problem personally. I think being open with these open source about, the data. For example, if David Rosenhan had to produce, these were the pseudo patients and these were the hospitals, this wouldn't be an issue. If he was peer reviewed properly, it probably wouldn't be an issue. So I think openness about the process hopefully will lead to some change. But yeah, I don't want this to contribute to
the anti-science movement.
No, I do not. I hope it doesn't.
How are you, Harry? What do you think? Does it make us not trust academic research?
Well, there certainly have been highly publicized cases of academic fraud before this, and I'm sure there will be in the future. I mean, part of the problem and the challenge is that there's such pressure, for example, to get grants, to publish, to get ahead. And so I think the temptation potentially, to have data that are really exciting or groundbreaking, even if they don't exist. I guess one can't be surprised. There's significant academic fraud. I'm not sure what you do. I think more due diligence is important and necessary. One thing that Susannah pointed out, by the way, as far as my own experience and use of data that had not occurred to me. So, I was a footnote in the study, and for the rest of my life, I will be known as Harry Footnote Lando. But Susannah pointed out that while I was a footnote in the article itself, there were specific statements that directly referenced my participation had to come from me. And you really can't have it both ways.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, so going back to the conclusions of the study. So one of the reasons that it's been so powerful is that it asks that profound question: if that's up there, sanity and insanity exist, how do we know them? And so now we wouldn't say sanity and insanity, of course. We'd say mental health and if mental health or mental illness exists, how do we know them? So given your experiences with the study and in your own lives, how would you answer that question now? Starting with you, particularly, you said you went through a period where you were diagnosed with a severe mental illness.
I think it's such a great question, and it's something that I grapple with. And I remember actually someone asked me that question, and I was supposed to answer it in one sentence, and I was like, okay, I can't do that. I mean, these are.
Do that.
Yeah, exactly. He said we can safely assume. He said we can safely now conclude that we cannot tell the difference between sanity and insanity. He did in one sentence, which I think was maybe not completely fair. But I think that my view of this kind of dichotomy question, that sanity, insanity, mental health, mental wellness, there's such a continuum of this. And many of us will straddle the line between the two. I mean, of course, there are extreme cases. I'm an extreme case of that, my experience. But I think in most of our lifetimes.
Could you talk a little bit about your experience?
Oh, yeah, sure. So I was 24 in 2009. I started at first feeling very kind of profoundly depressed and unlike myself. Very lethargic, and within a very short period of time, I became highly manic, and then would rapid cycle into depression. So I'd be kind of the most intensely alive in a way I've ever felt. Moments later, I'd be crying under my desk. And the night that was at its height, I had my first seizure, and then after that, started to have psychosis, and I started to hallucinate. I was delusional. at times violent, very, very aggressive. And I was hospitalized for 1 month at NYU Medical Center, where I had to be restrained in a chest posy. I was sedated often. I tried to escape multiple times. And my diagnoses started at bipolar 1 was the rule out diagnosis, and then it graduated to schizoaffective disorder. And by the end of it, I was accurately diagnosed with an autoimmune encephalitis of the brain. But you know, it mirrored a lot of the same, you know, presentation of kind of first break, and the age match too.
Yeah. And given all you went through, would you, and this sort of goes back to what you said in your opening, would you say you were mentally ill? Or in your first book, you sort of like, you're almost, many people are trying to claim like you have a physical illness.
Yes.
But looking at it back after doing the whole Rosenhan, would you say you were mentally ill for that period?
I would. And that comes from, that has been an education that this book gave me. And this is a gift that this book gave me. So when I was first diagnosed, I didn't want to tell anyone. I wanted it to go away. I was ashamed of what happened. I didn't understand it. All I knew was that most of the memories I had at that time were unreliable and scary. And as I started to get better, and I knew I wanted to write about this experience, and I got I could wrap my arms around it a little bit better, especially because it was so solid. Like my body's immune system attacked my brain. I can do that in one sentence, right? Yeah. And I wanted everyone to know that I had a physical illness, and I wanted everyone to know what I didn't have, which was a mental illness, right? It was a way of proclaiming to the world, I am sane, not insane, right? And after everything that I've gone through in terms of interfacing with medical community and people suffering from serious mental illness, and various, on this line, jumping around the line, I started to realize, oh no, I had a mental illness. I was just born during a time when we carved out the cause of mine, and I had a treatment. I had a cure. So I was lucky. I was profoundly lucky on so many levels. And I do believe, and I have to say, even though this book takes on a darker turn in terms of talking about where mental health care is today, because in many ways it's a travesty, but I am optimistic, and I can't help but think that I had this amazing magic bullet, which doesn't really exist in medicine that often. Yeah. How could I not think that one day people who are suffering can have similar
magic bullets?
Yeah. I have to be optimistic. And I've interfaced with a lot of amazing people on the front lines of research, but also on the front lines of care, who are doing incredible work. And so I've remained optimistic about that, definitely.
Great. Before turning to Harry, remember there's going to be questions, so make sure to fill out a card if you want to ask a question by the card. So Harry, did your experience as being a pseudo patient, did it give you insight, did it give you insight into what is mental health or what is mental illness, or change your perspective on it?
Yes, I think it did. I mean, first of all, I really didn't know what to expect, and I had, I think, this overly dramatic idea of what mental illness was, or particularly for somebody who might wind up in a psychiatric hospital, that they would be all this really extreme acting out. And, I was nervous about that. I think I expected to see more obvious signs of pathology. And part of it was that, and I did see someone, I visited Bill Underwood at Agnew State in the locked ward, which was such a dismal, depressing place, atmosphere, no stimulation, people being warehoused, people engaging in rhythmic rocking behavior, stuff like that. I wound up, I think people could sense that this was a benign environment. And so the behaviors that I observed were not nearly as obviously psychotic or disturbed as I had expected. And in some cases, it really took me a while, since the staff did not wear uniforms, to distinguish between patients and staff. And I will say also, okay, so patients had serious problems. They really did, but the extent to which they supported and cared for each other despite their own challenges, to me, was remarkable. And I think about some of the circumstances. So one of the patients I became particularly close to, Ed, this was at the height of the Vietnam War, it was 1970. Ed had actually been drafted into the Coast Guard, and he had been for 8 months on this tiny island somewhere out in the Pacific with all these gung-ho recruits, And, you know, Ed was a pacifist. In some ways, he reminded me of my younger brother, and he lost it. I mean, it seems almost like a rational response to me. So I would say that I expected, not knowing anything about it, more obvious evidence of overtly psychotic behavior than I saw.
Thank you. So one more question before I turn it over to the audience. So since in 1973, when that article was first published, there probably was, you know, 500,000, maybe 550,000 beds in state-run mental hospitals. Now there's probably 35,000 beds. Minnesota is one of the states doing the worst in terms of availability of beds in state hospitals for people with severe mental illnesses. So given the landscape has changed so dramatically since that time, where do you think we should be going now? And what are our obligations, or what should we be doing in terms of services and policies for people with the most severe mental illnesses?
You know, I mean, I think at the bare minimum, providing care, housing, meals is like just the baseline, right? And we're obviously not doing that, as you just described. Yeah. I mean, I think that like the very conservative numbers say that we're 95,000 beds short of a need. That's, you know, 100,000 people who who are seriously in need of help, who are not getting it. And where are they ending up? Oftentimes on our streets, oftentimes in our prisons and jails. And these are the worst places for someone going through a serious mental illness, and serious illness of any kind. And I often think, you know, if people were, you know, you can be psychotic and have Alzheimer's disease. If we had that same number of people on our streets and in our prisons with Alzheimer's, I think that we would have intervened by now. So, you know, this was an education for me of how broken the system is. And, you know, I never thought I'd be advocating for, you know, reopening places. I mean, obviously they can't be the places of the past. And Oliver Sacks actually wrote this beautiful essay called The Return to the Asylum, or The Lost Virtue of the Asylum. And he's talking about the asylum in the old sense of this word, of a place of refuge, of safe haven, kind of like what Harry experienced. So, you know, I think that we need to, in a kind of push away from all the horrors of the past, I think we've lost sight of some of the basic needs that we're not providing people. And I hope that this book opens up a larger dialogue, or helps to open up a larger dialogue about that, because I think we went too extreme in reaction to a very horrific situation.
Harry?
I think there actually were some good intentions and then some unintended consequences, because the movement really started. I mean, the number of hospital beds peaked in the mid-1950s, so it had been gone down pretty significantly by the time that Rosenhan came along. And, you know, seeing the horror stories and seeing the warehousing and so forth, the idea that people could be treated in the community, not having the long-term stays, not having neglect. So there were actually some good ideas behind it, but as Susannah points out in her book, really the money, the resources did not follow. And, you know, I talk about human rights a lot in my teaching, and the right to health and the right to support for health, including mental health. And I think, as you say, Susannah, we've fallen way short. So I think we need to have a re-examination. I think there are things that could be done. I mean, the model of a short-term respite for people who are severely mentally ill, I mean, it's not going to fit for everybody. Some people probably will always be institutionalized, but I think we need to get back to some of that, and we need to treat it with the seriousness it deserves. And somehow, and this is something that some of our students have taken on as an issue, we need to work against the stigma, because there's so much stigma. And, you know, so adding the stigma to all the other problems and lack of resources just makes the problem that much more challenging.
Thank you. Okay, we're opening it up for questions now. I have some on the cards, but if anyone wants to go to a mic, are there mics available? I thought there was someone wandering around with mics.
I think she's up there. She has a mic coming.
Yeah, just repeat it.
Okay, so if anyone wants to ask a question in person, feel free to.
So my question has to do with, Susannah, do you believe at one time it was much easier to commit people?
Right.
Do Do you believe it was Rosenhan's study that changed some of that from a policy perspective?
There were a series of landmark acts that happened around this time, and I do think that Rosenhan gave support to those acts for sure, and it made it harder to commit people with good reason, because you have story after story of a lot of inconvenient people, a lot of times inconvenient wives and women, you know, institutionalized because, you know, we don't want them around anymore. So you obviously don't want that. So it's just this balancing act. And I think in a way of like, we became aware of how horrendous the situation was. And we kind of recoiled as a society, and we recoiled almost too violently, I think. But yes, I do believe that the patient rights acts and the movements there, Rosenhan definitely played a role in that. They were happening before, but I think that it provided some kind of science-sanctioned evidence, you know, some kind of like data-driven proof of a lot of these convictions, definitely.
One of the questions from the audience is, after your hospital stay, did you go back to work at the New York Post?
Oh, yeah.
And if you did, how did people react to you?
Oh, very interesting question. So yeah, I did. It took me, the recovery was in the scheme of things, not very long, but it felt like a long time. It was about 9 months, and it took me quite some time to return to my baseline again. I didn't realize, but it took me a while. And I returned about I think 9 months after my diagnosis. And the Post, they were very, very kind to me there. I don't know what they knew or what they didn't know, but I had my boss had a close friend who had schizophrenia, and he was actually had identified her symptoms when she was working for him. And I think he kind of identified some of that in me, and seeing me return, even if I was not fully back, I think it reminded him of that person. And so he was very kind to me during that time. And I mean, they would sit down. I was not only, a change, but I was cognitively different too, because I was still recovering. And so they would give me the kind of easy stories, like the hottest bartender in New York City stories.
I don't think that's easy.
Yeah,
There's a lot of bartenders.
there are a lot of good-looking bartenders, but But no, but they would sit down and they were patient, and they didn't move anything off my desk for 8 months or whatever it was, and then they would kind of rewrite the piece and go through the whole kind of standards of the basic standards of it again over with me, and I felt really, really supported. I was very lucky.
Did you experience any of the stigma of mental illness, either from colleagues or friends or family?
Absolutely, especially when I hadn't told the world yet what had happened. And in fact, this is a kind of testament to another reason why I want to say I think it's important that we think of what I had as a mental illness, because the minute it became a neurological, immune-driven illness, there was zero stigma.
Yeah.
So and when that word got out, no one stigmatized my behaviors. So if you think about that as a mental illness, like why do we make the separation? If these are brain diseases, brain illnesses, why, if we know the exact cause in my case, is it different than we don't quite know what the cause is in another case? But in that brief period of time when I didn't quite understand what had happened to me, and especially before my diagnosis, I saw firsthand what it was like to be labeled. At one point, a psychiatrist who's now a close friend came and interviewed me, and I got her medical records, and in it she described a white t-shirt that I was wearing and black leggings as revealing, and that was sign of hypersexuality, which supported her bipolar 1 diagnosis. So you definitely are seen through the prism of your label of your diagnosis, and I experienced that even in the short period of time.
And that's so much exactly Rosenhan's point.
Exactly.
Even though his might have been he might have come to that conclusion through falsified data. He makes that exact point, that everything you do is interpreted through the lens of that diagnosis.
Exactly. I said, he touched on the truth as he danced around it. I mean, there's truth in this, and I do grapple with the legacy of the study now. After this book and how it's going to be taught. I do still hope that it's taught in clinical environments, because I think that there are really important takeaways. Still,
And Donna, I do need to say that, while my experience was very positive, in one respect, it did support Rosenhan, because still my behavior was interpreted as being entirely consistent with the underlying diagnosis. Now, I did engage in extensive writing when I was in the hospital, as did the other pseudo-patients, and certainly that could be seen as, somehow abnormal behavior, but they also indicated I showed shallow affect and a number of other things. Pretty much everything was interpreted, even in this really excellent facility, as consistent with the diagnosis. On the other hand, I did go through and get successive passes and was actually released outright. In fact, was encouraged by the staff to be released, apparently, as far as we know, unlike the other pseudo-patients.
Well, it's a good point that you bring up the passes, though. However, Harry did apply for a night pass and was rejected because they felt he wasn't prepared, that he was still too sick to spend the night out of the hospital. So, you experienced that labeling and the effect of that as well. Yeah, definitely.
An audience question? Todd? Go.
Hi, my name is Kaz Nelson. I'm a psychiatrist here at the University of Minnesota. Thank you for being here and all your sharing. I'm responsible for the education of the psychiatry trainees coming up through the system. And I'm just wondering if you could encapsulate an idea or a take-home point for these people grappling with making psychiatric diagnoses through the lens that they're carrying with them. What suggestions would you have for them?
I mean, this might seem overly simplified and maybe like pie-eyed, but I think coming at each, and it's a hard thing, because psychiatry is a very hard job. You're taking complex issues with sometimes difficult patients. You're trying to get patient histories. You have to interview a lot of people to get a full picture. You're basing a lot on signs and symptoms. It's not an easy road. I think coming at each person as an individual is one of the most important things you can do. And, we have electronic medical records, which now make it easy to kind of cut and paste, and I think contribute more to this labeling and this viewing people through a diagnosis. So, yeah, I'm not a fan of electronic medical records, but what I hope is that, this is a reminder that each person comes with a whole host of things in your environment, the trauma in your childhood. All these things have an effect on you, your illness, etc. And I do hope that this is a reminder to come at each case as an individual and as a person-to-person contact as much as possible. And again, I realize that might sound a little cheesy, but that's okay. Good. Okay, thank you.
That would be exactly my answer too.
Oh, good. Okay, good.
However cheesy it is.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's this wishy-washy area, which is what makes psychiatry so great when it's done well. Mm-hmm. It's this person-to-person, human-to-human art of clinical care. And I think in some ways in the push to medicalize psychiatry, which Rosenhan studied definitely pushed forward, we've lost a lot of that. And I hope that there's a return to that side of clinical care.
Another audience question, Todd?
I just want to follow up. The potential for bias is certainly there and present. It looks like we maybe not label it fraud, but I guess two questions. One is that found in the secondary experiment where the pseudo patients were reportedly set out and institutions identified and reported finding pseudo patients? So one, Rosenhan attempted to do a counterfactual kind of follow-up, right. And what happened to the data on that, mm-hmm. Similar kind of thing. And then second, all of us that have read Rosenhan, we certainly in the methods world think about, it's clear there's an experimenter expectation. In fact, mm-hmm. That Theodore Barber talks about, that social science is really suspect. We really have problems. And one of the things, Harry, asking you, okay, you had these expectations, you watched this study go on, you participated in this study. How would you try and control for this experimenter expectation effect that Rosenhan gets the answer he's searching for, which most classic social experiments do?
Okay, so let's start with the first one. Yeah. So also in that article, he mentions another part of his experiment for those of you who are not familiar with it, that Todd brings up, where some of his colleagues at the time said, "Oh, this is nonsense. There's no way I would ever be, that would ever happen in my hospital. Right. Pseudo patients couldn't come in. We would discover them." And so Rosenhan, being oh so very clever, yeah, said, "Okay, we sent some pseudo patients into your hospital. And so at the end of this period, you tell us which ones you discovered." And they came back and they said, oh, here's the ones we found, these fake patients. Well, he hadn't sent any in.
And they found 41.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's my favorite part of the study. I love that part of the study. Did it happen? I have no proof that it happened.
That's what I'm wondering.
Well, yeah. So I found the questionnaire, the one questionnaire, where it actually is a little bit more complicated. It has a sliding scale of, could this be a possible pseudo-patient, which is a little more gray than this is a pseudo-patient. So instead, they were supposed to be giving this questionnaire for each patient and rating on that scale, what likelihood could they be a pseudo-patient, which is less damning than the study shows. But I only found one scrap of paper and I found zero data on that. So I don't know. There was a rumor, there were two rumors I tried to track down. One that it happened at Mass General, two that it happened at Stanford. I could not find any evidence that it did. That doesn't mean it didn't. And I think, again, that harkens back to the idea that there is some legitimacy. David Rosenhan did go undercover, and he did find those, he did have an incredible experience. Like, for example, it's not in the paper, but he had an experience where he was sitting down writing, and an attendant sat down and started talking and engaging, and it was the first time someone had looked him in the eye, right? And he felt, oh my gosh, this is amazing. He finally felt seen, and they're having this wonderful conversation, and then he notices the nurses are laughing, and they're kind of calling the attendant over, and the attendant goes and they're doubled over and laugh, and they hand him a file. The attendant is nowhere to be found. Again, every time David goes over to him, he pushes him aside, and he's kind of hostile. And David goes to the bathroom, he splashes water on his face, and he looks in the mirror and he realizes he thought I was a doctor. That's why he was talking to me. I mean, these are amazing stories that did happen. So that's why I think, like, when I don't want to say it's a fraud, and I don't want to completely say this is completely untrue, because that's not the case. There is truth. Harry did go in. Bill Underwood did go in, but there were some serious, inconsistencies and problems with the data in a way that goes beyond just the social science bias of the experimenter. I mean, it's full on manipulating data and leaving data out, and actually, like, in some places, completely fabricating data.
And to the second part of the question, how do we prevent experimenter effects, or sort of getting what we expect to get in our research?
Well, if I could answer that question, Donna.
More than a footnote.
Yes, maybe so. But I mean, I think raising awareness of some of the issues is important. I think there may be more protections in place, in terms of potential academic fraud, but it's still incredibly challenging, and to detect it. And as I say, I don't know that this rises to the level of fraud, but the bias, like, you mentioned the Zimbardo study, which I'm very familiar with, the prison experiment. And Zimbardo had his own strong biases as well. And maybe part of it is the data were relatively soft in this study. And I don't know how much of a difference that makes, as opposed to something where we have so he reported on, number of pills and time staff spent, which apparently are not very accurate, but for them, an awful lot of the data were impressionistic. So what happens when it's a much more quantitative environment? Like in my own research, a year later, what proportion of people are abstinent? That seems pretty objective. So I think just being aware of it and being able, and I think this is really a challenge if you're Rosenhan or if you're Zimbardo or what have you, you have your strong bias, and trying to set that aside, as difficult as it is. So I even think about the fact, I had a bias when I went into the hospital, because Rosenhan had talked about how depersonalizing these places were. I had visited Bill, I saw it firsthand. So I had a definite expectation when I went in. It just turned out that the reality that I encountered was so dramatically different.
Thank you. Well, we have to wrap up now. So thank you all for coming and for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. Thank you so much, both of you. It's been great to have a chance to talk to you. And Harry, hopefully you will come back to my class again this year. And every time he comes, I learn more, and it makes me think about things differently. So thank you both. We invite the audience to join a reception and book signing in the auditorium, or in the atrium, following this event. And if you want to hear more about the Great Pretender, Susannah is at Majors and Quinn bookstore tonight. She's had a busy day. She'll be there tonight at 7 p.m. And the School of Public Health will be holding another great event on Friday in this auditorium at 12, featuring the New York Times healthcare correspondent, Margot Sanger-Katz. So please think about coming to that and register on our website. So again, thank you so much, both of you, for your time and your comments. I very much appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you for your